Chapter 4. Memory Hole. What is a subspace quant? Such a curious question. I suppose that it is best defined as a standardized volume of extra-dimensional space-time. It is the stuff of the Oneros pulled from that place into ours. It is a twofold blasphemy, really. First, in measuring the stuff of our souls like some baker portioning flour. Second, and perhaps most profane, is that mere act of bringing the light of your highest self to drown into the dreary night of our mundane world. Robert Allen Samaire, Valda, Eater of Twisted Hearts.
Germaine and I walked in awkward silence all the way to the number 3 key of Alden Wild's ferry. Our badges got us fast-tracked through the mundane security checks, past the scanners and the sweepers, and all the way up to the smiling-faced young man whose job was to kill us if we failed to pass the black corridor. His name tag read Gilbert St. Wrath, and he gave us a chipper wave as the fear of God's judgment came bearing down on us. Germaine, as always, reacted to the seraphim's blazing swords with sweat. Big fat beads collecting on his scalp, pooling on the furrows and folds of his face and neck. It was like he was a giant rag being squeezed out. As for me, the first step into that featureless mat tunnel was like being alone and naked in front of 1,000 copies of my mother, and she was laughing and jeering with 1,000 throats. It was a sensation like I was being crushed into a shriveled husk inside my own body. 9 unbearable steps with my cheeks burning, tears welling in my eyes, and the blood of Kamal thundering in my ears. Walk with me, striving mother. Walk with me, stern father. Hold my hand in trial and tribulation. Hold my hand in want and waste. Shelter my soul in the breadth of thy wings. Carry my life to judgment. Exalted will beyond reason. The old prayers came unbidden to my lips, and once again I remembered why I believed. Not the intellectual computation of the observable reality of God's angels. The resonant truth of feeling bare to the judgment of something far vaster than you. An intellect and power so far beyond that of man that it rendered you quaking and afraid. Worship wasn't just a logical conclusion. It was truth. I gazed slightly to my right and found that Germaine too was lost in catechism. He was reciting the death prayer, and I could see the shadow of the seraphim in his eyes, a glimpse of their black feathers reflected into reality for just a moment. There was the fainted sound of wings beating from a vast distance, and then it was done. The black corridor was done, and Gilbert St. Wrath gave us an enthusiastic thumbs up from beyond the infinite chasm we just crossed. My hands wiped the tears from my ears, and Germaine saw to mopping his brow. Neither of us gazed too hard at the other. It was supremely bad manners to dwell on the effects of the seraphim in others. There were always restrooms on either side of a black corridor, but as luck would have it, both me and my partner had managed to avoid any overt need. Many lost control of bladder or bowel, thus making sure one was empty was a high priority. Or if perhaps one had been insufficient in their preparations, a quick cleanup might be required. We took a slow 30 seconds to compose ourselves, and the regulars pushed by us, faces hard and eyes locked ahead. Despite the 100 souls that needed screening, it took only 20 minutes to completely fill the ferry. The rotund vessel was docked at the bottom of a spiral staircase-style airlock and was laid out like the commercial bus that it was. There were row after row of seats covered in worn mauve upholstery, attended by aging but still functional safety harnesses. The only concession to aesthetics was the great wide view that the transparent ceiling offered. Half a meter of treated water sandwiched between centimeter-thick plates of spun diamond made the window into the void, nearly impervious to both cosmic radiation and the stray bit of debris. It was also a pretty good shield against most mundane weapons, but nothing serious would be given even a slight pause. Germaine and I silently made our way to our designated seats and politely declined the aid of a multi-armed attendant drone. It was to be a short jaunt, so there was little need for it, beyond help fastening the harness, which I was certainly not going to ask for.
Good evening, this is your pilot speaking.
The announcement came over the PA system, as well as broadcast on all the utility frequencies.
This is the 1935 shuttle to Adam Reverend Dock 21. Our estimated in flight will be 25 minutes including docking. Movement around the cabin during acceleration or deceleration is potentially fatal, so we would ask you to remain seated. Please note that use of any morphoactive is strictly forbidden and may result in lethal retaliation from station or onboard systems. The local net welcomes all commercial and recreational browsing, but attempts to access nodes from range QE23 to QZ90 is a violation of the Digital Integrity Act and is a prosecutorial offense. If you look directly vertical during our approach, we have reports that Boneweight Lover is dancing a waltz on the skin of Adam Reverend near Dock 18, and I'm going to attempt to give you all a glimpse. Sit back and enjoy your flight.
It took barely 10 seconds from the conclusion of the in-flight patter to the main thrusters engaging. There was a glittering spray of superheated steam blasted back from the shuttle's launch cradle, and then crushing acceleration of spaceflight pressed its great hands on everyone in the cabin. It was a jaunt across 79 kilometers of hard vacuum from Aldanewild on Joseph to the 7th section of the Adam habitat, which was named Reverent. The ferry was sluggish, compared to most spacecraft even in its own short-range class, but at the end of the day was perfectly serviceable as the economy bus that it was. The world I knew spun above my head, and I couldn't help but stare. As jaded as I purport to be, there is always something grand about traversing the Ark. Longer distance trips between planets and distant stars were difficult for the human mind to comprehend. The distances were so vast and the vision of the eye so limited that there wasn't much sensation of movement, even for those with expanded ability to think of such things, like myself. The megastructure of the Ark, however, was just vast enough to truly awe, but not so vast as to diminish itself in the mind. The basic structure of the thing was fittingly that of a cross, with an extra set of arms going forwards and backwards. The smaller X and Y spars contained the maneuvering engines, and the 75-kilometer-long main drive formed the Z spar. Hanging from the arms of the hypercross like enormous caterpillar larvae hung the habitats. There are 4 great habs: Adam, Mary, Joseph, and Esther, one on each arm of the cross. Next to them sat their grow habitats, where the matryoshka farms provide the raw sustenance needed to sustain the millions upon millions who lived and swarmed around the greatest working of mankind. Space around Trinity was always busy. Bulk haulers containing millions of tons of frozen fish docked at the massive meat piers of Esther, while billions of rounds worth of repeater munitions were shipped out from the industrial manufactories of Mary. The expanse surrounding Adam was always a thicket of metallic asteroids being mined for resources, and the furious and flashing chaos of the shipyards they fuel. In between, the habitats flitted the 10,000 mayflies of commerce, this and that business, exchanging with this and that concern. The private habitats floated on their tethers, cruising pleasure ships slowly revolved and in and around all the gaudy, flashy civilians. The black sharks of the 4th banner lurked, dutiful and on guard against all manner of threat. The combined effect was that of a vast kaleidoscope of activity and light that spanned the entire field of your vision. When seen from the tiny perspective of a low-rent interhab shuttle flight, it was like being a minnow in a school of iridescent whales who spouted long silent gouts of rocket fire or wild rainbow sprays of superheated water. Taken with the vast, slowly spinning habitats, the vista is stunning, especially for an infrequent traveller such as myself. Still, as we neared Adam Reverend, I found myself sinking slightly into melancholy and dread. As promised, the captain rotated the craft so that the inky skin of the habitat came to dominate the entirety of our vision. I could feel all the other passengers cease whatever activities that consumed them and refocus on the view. Most of the regular commuters were inured to the majestic view of the Ark, but none were immune to the pull of a living saint. The silence was broken by a single indrawn breath, and every soul on board found their eyes drawn to the burning white silhouette that flitted across the black expanse. She was nude and alabaster with jagged lines of silver and black tracing the contours of her body. It was impossible to see her features as her halo of radioactive fire burned Scifi into the deep gamma and purest white in the visible spectrum blinding the eye that sought her face. She danced slowly, a languid old world waltz, yet each hopping step carried her dozens of meters, and where she alighted, I could see a single perfect pearl the size of an apple snap into existence and then slowly drift off into the void. The habitats were vast by human standards, but they possessed no significant gravity, and while the dancing saint merrily ignored the laws of physics, her creations were subjects of objective reality. Still, the busy and scared part of my mind could not help but run the numbers. Average weight per unit volume of a natural pearl, approximate radius of the pearls she left in her wake, approximate mass created ex nihilo, and finally, mass times the speed of light squared to get the number of gigajoules worth of energy that was being willed into existence with each step. It was cold, sweaty fear that clouded my synapses as the treacherous whispers of my mind reminded me that the bone-weight lava was not the most dangerous thing I had ever seen. We docked at Adam Reverend at Bay 21 without further incident and once again braved the black corridor. Germaine and I stood shaking and sweaty and gazed out onto the staid tranquility of Adam. Adam is perhaps the most important habitat on the Ark. It is home to the Trinity shipyards, as well as the greatest large-scale habitat manufactory in existence. As a result, the residential sections that intersperse the massive dry docks are some of the safest and most pastoral of all of Christendom. If you are obscenely rich, you work in Mammon's cradle on Hab Joseph and live in the manses that line the Ashfall Preserve. If you are destitute and ambitious, you live in the spider nest above the Hab Mary manufactories and try your luck with high technology and endless labor. If you are middle class and ruthless, you ply a shop on the riotous Hab Esther, trading with the incoming spacers and avoiding the inevitable violence. If you are poor and faithless, then you live squeezed into the tent cities that drift through the exclusion channels and maintenance lines that riddle the superstructure of the Ark itself. However, if you were middle class and boring, then Adam was the place to be, a mecca of middle-class vacuum workers and their broods. Germaine and I walked the 2 miles between our disembarkation point and our destination. We didn't have to. The trams that buzzed merrily down the wide avenues would have taken us rapidly to our destination, and either of us could have unfolded our pocket bicycles and been there in minutes. Still, there was an unspoken desire to take our time, compose ourselves. The name of the soul bank that held our answers was Quanta Mentis Memoriam, or QAM3 for short. The obnoxious capitalization was a relic of a naming fad that had died out nearly 2 centuries prior, preserved by tradition and inertia. At least that was what Nervash told me. My genius scattered useless tidbits and useful operational details about the most ancient and illustrious of corporations that was our destination. Above us, the central illumination array burned an evening orange, and all around us the humanity of Adam flowed. There was a pattern that quickly emerged. The pious patriarch would walk with his good wife, and while they whispered and chuckled, their minor children would swarm and flux about them, while the elder daughters would do their best to corral the multitude. Sons on the cusp of their majority could be seen laughing and struggling at sport or mischief in the greenways that ran down the center of the walkways. Sidewalk cafes were populated by discreet couples, and the airspace above was devoid of advertising or commerce. If you were to ask your average low city scum what life in the promised land of the Arks was like, then the world they would paint would be best reflected in the Adam residential sections. It was a paradise of sorts. I hated it. We had already been flagged 191 times by the locals as suspicious. Had the supervisory daemon not already been apprised of our identity, then one of the law enforcement drones would have already sashayed out of their discreet cubbies and interrogated us as to our purpose here. There is a power in intolerance and conformity, a massive energy that reinforced itself and shepherded a society as it plunged forward with almost psychotic focus. Adam was a place that knew who it was and what it wanted to become, and all that was strange or aberrant was unwelcome and expunged. Being excellent was encouraged, but being exceptional was frowned upon. I stewed and tried to ignore the locals' reproach as I walked. It was a challenge to retain my focus. It was always infuriating to be judged, and worse be judged by those that were patently your inferior. Still, the mark of a superior mind was its control. And by the time Jermaine and I had arrived at our destination, I was as level as a platonic solid. I was a little too jaded for the building that housed QMM to impress me unduly, but it was undeniably fucking gorgeous. About 300 and change years ago, with the ink still wet on the packs, there was a bit of an architectural renaissance. A lot of people with a lot of talent wanted to get away from the killing and the hardship and the artistic privation that had marked the vast majority of their lives. This desire neatly dovetailed with the breadth of wartime innovations in both rational and supernal fields. An aching desire to create beauty fused with engineering that surpassed reason, and the result was feats of art and architecture that were free from the constraints of reality, on the pure expression of imagination. The tower that QMM had bought out and now occupied was aptly named the Orchid. It was one of those products of that post-war flowering, pun intended, and appeared to be nothing less than a bouquet of metallic orchids on a stunning scale. The body of the building was composed of 100 stalks, melded together into a slightly irregular cylinder. At strategic intervals, these stalks would blossom into enormous flowers, varying in size but each at least 6 meters wide, with most being of scale with a car or a jumper. Some of the blossoms were along the side of the building, but the majority exploded from the roof, or rather, composed the roof. Nervash told me that the flowers were actually functional, concealing transmission dishes, power arrays, and other odds and ends. It was a fantastic investment of capital to own a home. It costs even more to buy a residence of any significant size. The amount of money that had been shelled out to buy an entire tower boggles the mind. Here, in the endless night, space is the ultimate premium. Yes, Ark Trinity was always expanding, but each extra meter of habitat was eagerly occupied by an endless stream of immigrants. The Ark throttles immigration heavily, but not nearly heavily enough to stop space from being a constant problem. On top of the already borderline levels of legal influx, there is the constant problem of illegals. The billion kilometers of hard vacuum that separated Trinity from the nearest human habitation is one hell of a fence. However, when you can digitize and transmit a mind through the grid and then download it into a body on the other end, there is not a fence in the world large enough to keep those with the will out. Most corporations operated entirely in virtual, only spending money on real-world space for manufacturing or research as these things were required. QMM dealt almost entirely in data, so you would think that their need for physical space would be nil. In fact, many other soul banks did just that, holding the off-self backups of their customers, fragmented in a million different networks. QMM, however, did things a little differently. They went with the Iron Vault strategy and had centralized their entire setup into a single impenetrable fortress. For a variety of reasons that have to do with the vagaries of the soul, this is a valid strategy. Valid enough that QMM is one of, if not the top-rated soul banks in the entire breadth and beyond. They also provide secure reincarnation services, as well as body rental. They had a full surgical setup for implanting save points, as well as a menu factory for several custom pieces of cybernetics that were useful in the ongoing evasion of death. These, along with the quantum entanglement comms. Neutrino arrays and resonance nets occupied the bulk of the physical space in the tower. The corporation did all of their administrative and insurance work online, but there was no external access to most of the saved minds that lurked in their vaults. The front door of QM was done up with the same metallic floral motif as the rest of the building. Smoky glass, actually plastic, Nivash told me, framed in twining silver creepers with a braided chain of lilies making up the legally mandatory manual ingress handles. I sincerely doubt that a human hand had touched those handles since they were installed. But building code demanded that there be no such thing as a fully automated door. Many people scoffed at this seemingly archaic mandate, but I have had long conversations with decorated Atmos MTech, and they assure me that when shit goes sideways, a manual entry system is a godsend. As we approached the building, the public augmented reality interface displayed a floating prompt in the upper left-hand corner of my vision, asking if we wanted to join the QMM local AR. I had Nervash accept the invitation and was immediately awash in a new layer of augmented reality. The setup was pretty tasteful. A lot of individuals and some companies like to go a bit overboard with the augmented reality. Giant displays of grandeur and spectacle, gaudy and impossible decor. You know, the school of thought that seems to think that more bells and whistles is always better. QMM, in contrast, had gone with minimalism. A basic directory with call functions superimposed itself on the wall, and a demon receptionist appeared in the center of the lobby, arms held behind her back, waiting for my attention. It went well with the spare silvery aesthetic. Let you spend some time admiring their use of space and give you a chance to notice the intricate organic tracery that covered the walls and ceiling. Jermaine waited for me to make the first move. He was the street-level bruiser, and he relied on my rich girl sensibilities when it came to the more elite circles. It wasn't that he didn't have his own manner of getting what he needed. It was just that if he allowed me to go first, then once my charm failed, we would still have the option of his bold intimidation. It was a rare case where the sequence worked in reverse. After a few moments of admiring the scenery, I turned and regarded the demon. She was a magnificent piece of work. Apparently, all of the graphical design effort that had not been spent on the decor had been rechanneled into the demon. She was stunningly real. A woman carved from living wood with a flowing mane of vine and blooming flowers. She was dressed in a conservative business suit tied with a neckerchief that seemed to be carved from the heart of an inferno. It flickered and crackled while remaining confined to the outlines of a piece of mortal clothing. It was only after I had finished admiring the craftsmanship that the demon offered a modest bow and spoke.
Good evening, Deacon Inspector McLauglin. My name is Arcadia. How may I be of assistance to you and your companion?
I was impressed. Running a system that could cut through my shroud even on low settings was no mean feat. It meant that the demon had grown emergent facial algorithms, or was hooked into an organic matrix of some type, which meant, in simpler terms, that either instead of relying on bone structure mapping or gait recognition, the creature of ones and sorrows had learned the hard way to recognize people by averaging 1,000 metrics, or that it was cribbing this knowledge off some living brain that was linked or shadowed into its command strings. Of course, there was also the possibility that none of this was true, and that instead of being exceptionally clever, the system simply had done a deep scan when we entered the building. You can't hide from a deep scan. "Hello," I responded. "I am Tatsuki McLauglin, and this is my partner Jermaine Wittenauer. We are here in regards to a client of yours, one Damien Faulkner."
Ah, yes.
Arcadia pursed her lips as if in thought, and then offered a radiant smile.
Deacon Chief Superintendent Nim told me that you might be coming by. Come right this way. I will show you to Director Rakhir's offices. She has all the information you will be needing.
I did my best to graciously accept the invitation, all the while kicking myself over what an idiot I am. That was the problem with overthinking things. The system knew who I was because it had been told to expect me and had made a reasonable guess. There was no advanced pattern algorithms or penetrating scanners. Just a simple, "My agents will be stopping by from the boss." Occam's razor once again proving itself to be the best tool in police work. The demon walked ahead of us and made a show of summoning the elevator. Truth was that all these little motions were nothing more than an elaborate dog and pony show. The demon didn't exist. She was a quirk of our perceptions, a stream of machine code that Nervash was picking up on the local network and projecting into my vision. No more than a technological hallucination. Even the burbling brook sound of Arcadia's voice was nothing more than a data stream that Nervash was channeling through my auditory nerve. If I was to hazard a guess as to the amount of money that augmented reality saved each year in hologram projector installation and maintenance, I would most likely say lots, and leave it at that. Truth was that there was not a real number to be had. Without AR layering to project whatever sort of vision the programmer wanted, you would be forced to make do with vastly less functional technology. Holograms were fiddly things, and even with all our advances in the ontological sciences, efficient and reliable holograms in a real-world environment were not really possible. The theatre back at the Alefecture was close, but if you wanted to have a functional holodeck, You still needed to spend some quants on the one-eric space-time to make it work, and quants cost even more than living space on the Habs. Arcadia stepped her illusionary self onto the elevator with us and tapped an icon about eye level on the glowing grid that layered the flawless silver surface of the elevator cabin. I knew that somewhere in here was a hidden panel that had the manual controls. But for most everyone who would have use of this elevator, interfacing with the AR grid was the only way to operate it. It served a dual function. First, it made it so that it was required to be on the grid to move about QMM's home turf, which of course meant that you were subject to their monitoring. Second, since they didn't have to install real physical buttons, you could easily edit the list of available floors, or the labeling thereof, without ever alerting a nosy party to the fact that something was being hidden from them. The list of floors I saw was about 10 too short to explain the height of the tower, and that was a conservative estimate. In general, people had a tendency to make all the floors in their building the same height, but that didn't mean that they were compelled to.
So, Suki, what line of pre-approved bullshit is Rack here gonna feed us?
Jermaine flashed the sending over our private channel. Well encrypted, even by the most paranoid of benchmarks, and through a tight channel to limit the chances that it could even be intercepted to begin with. If we were truly paranoid, we could have set up a dream net and enjoyed a nearly invulnerable network that didn't rely on such mortal concepts as line of sight. Truth was that we weren't that paranoid, or rather, we were paranoid in a different way. A DreamNet link-up was not just a line of communication, it was an interface of mind and soul. And just like you could transmit a digital virus over an electronic network, there were infections that could spread along the dreamline. It only takes one case of a suborned dreamlink to turn you off to the concept in a hurry. His sending seemed cordial and even convivial. Whatever strange blood our lunch had engendered, he at least had bled it all out. Most likely whatever gets us out of their hair as fast as possible, I responded. They seem to be upfront so far. Remember that if they hadn't requested the wellness check on our Vic, we wouldn't even know that he was dead.
Yet. You meant to say dead yet. Quante has to know that the cat always gets out of the bag, and they might have given up the info in an attempt to stay ahead of us. Keep our suspicions off them for now.
I smirked out a quick laugh. Do you think that we can reserve judgment on their deception level until they have actually had a chance to do more than say hello? Jermaine growled something under his breath. It didn't sound exceptionally complimentary. The doors smoothly slid open and Arcadia ushered us into a bygone age. The entire floor was done in a neo-Japanese style. A single enormous room that stretched from one side of the building to the other, interrupted only by the core line. Real rice paper screens, intricately painted, provided the necessary segmentations of the workspace. I could hear the burble of a koi pond, and a full quarter of the space was devoted to a traditional rock garden. I doubted highly that they had a human groundskeeper, more likely the intelligence that ran the building. Arcadia perhaps, if she was more than just a demon, saw to the upkeep of the environs of the various floors through teleoperated puppets. That being said, there were a lot of jobs now, a days that could be done by a robot if we were being strictly honest with ourselves. Arcadia paused at the edge of the tatami mats and doffed her entirely non-existent heels, stepped up and slipped into an equally non-existent set of slippers. She turned and offered us another 1,000-watt smile and tactfully kept her mouth shut. She was good, this one. She knew that we knew the procedure and was not going to waste her time and strain our patience by asking us to follow suit. So we unshod and followed in the footsteps of our host demon. We could afford to let the director think she was in charge. It would make what came next all the more effective. Shamala Rakhir, director of QMM, elect of the faithful and princeps of the quality, turned out to be a stunning woman, with the heart-shaped face of a 19-year-old girl, and the clean, muscular lines of a champion swimmer. The only indication of her true age was the iron-grey braid and the hard, flinty eyes that stared from beneath her immaculately penciled brow. There was a certain unstoppable mien that radiated from her. It was an ancient rootedness, a surety of centuries that dominated any room. Or rather, any room that didn't contain an industrial-strength dick.
Chammy.
Germaine chortled.
You don't mind if I call you Chammy, right?
The immortal noblewoman blanched ever so slightly, but kept an even and pleasant expression on her face. A palpable hit. Anyone of her wealth and status wore a biosculpted custom with full emotional controls, lying algorithms, and grace protocols. That tiny royal blush was the equivalent of frothing rage in a peasant.
Inspector Wittenauer, Inspector McLauglin, to what do I owe the pleasure?
She spoke evenly, and with only the tiniest hint of frost. Germaine smirked and managed to make himself so insufferable that even standing outside the line of fire invoked an almost primal desire to punch him. The director blanched again, and the slightest hint of colour began to creep up on her. He turned ever so slightly towards, and the toxic radiation of his smugness sloshed all over my mind.
So, Deacon Inspector, what questions can Chammy over here answer for us?
Germaine stressed the honorific title that the director had perhaps tellingly omitted. The rich and powerful were often very reticent to acknowledge that for all their wealth and puissance, they were almost helpless before the majesty of the throne. The yoke of the church bound us all together, and no king, president, or potentate could say that they did not bow to the will of the Gautama Christ and his church. This was why Germaine was so invaluable as a partner. His abrasive manner was shaking all manner of fruits from the tree named Chamala Rakhir. Nivash was scooping data from her now tense frame, using my instincts and his vast library of knowledge to come up with inferences that to an earlier generation of men would have seemed to be augury.
Ancient power, the war, the ways the things that slip between the cold evaluation of threats to the order of the pillar of the world, of the obligations and honor of the helm, of the place of the anger, of the control of the need for control of the knowledge, of nothing of the reign of the world, the numbers in their columns, the ducks in their rows, the pieces in their place.
The stream of impressions flashed by me. Nuggets of information, harvested from the fissures that Germaine was creating. I felt a brief spike of painful heat at the base of my skull. The processor load, this calculation was generating heat by the boatload, and my craniosho-abdominal heat sink was lagging slightly behind the demand. Normally Nervash let me handle my own first impressions, only chiming in with his 2 cents, if he felt it pertinent. However, against the carefully curated visage of Kamala Rakhir, a little more effort was required. Germaine continued to snipe at the director while he asked the basic questions. He knew what I was doing, and while he and Brunhilde were fully capable of getting a read on most people, he knew that I had both a better neural chassis and that Nervosh was specialized for high computation problems in a way that Brunhild was not. It only took half a dozen seconds before I had enough information. "She is clean," I interrupted Germaine, as he was adding one more layer of irritation on top of the Soul Bank's director. Apologies, but we had to be sure you were beyond suspicion. Finding reliable data on people of import was difficult. There was so much misinformation that it clouded the water to the point of opacity. Those with money, and some without, paid for various services to spread falsehoods about them on the grid, to blind searchers in a forest of lies. However, with the information that Navash and I had gleaned, it wasn't too hard to figure out what about Shamala Rak here was true and what was mere deception. Reading body language wasn't exceptionally useful as a standalone, but you could use what you found and cross-reference it against the available record to figure out a whole lot. Veteran and general of the last war and holder of not one, but 4 medals for valor and service. Ordained as a noble soul by the magisterium over a century ago, she had retired to manage her granted estates here on Trinity, and had served faithfully as the Director General of QMM, with a little to distinguish her save an accountant's precision and an unbelievably stable tenure. All books balanced and no fuck-ups. Exactly the sort of director you wanted for a bank. The iron-haired girl's lip quivered with a fraction of disgust, and she unfolded her stern visage into a bloodless smile. Her eyes were still alight with fury, and I didn't need my genius to make that evaluation. Still, with an expelled breath, all her visible emotions vanished behind the wall again.
I am glad to know that your disrespect and agitation had more of a purpose than sullying the quality of my day.
Her head tilted to the side.
Though I am interested to hear what you have learned from me that somehow lifts me above suspicion. Surely you need more than that to conclusively cross me off the list.
If you were a primary suspect, then yes, a rendering would be required. But that is far too much to ask of any of the elect without great need. Obviously, someone at your soul bank could still be involved in some way, but only someone with directorate clearance could manage most crimes. I neglected to mention that there had been occasional incidents at other soul banks, but it was mostly the truth. Security at these places was so paranoid and redundant that without a conspiracy or a man at the top, such crimes were almost impossible. I continued letting that little ace sit in the back of my pocket. However, the most important thing was learning that you didn't know the decedent. That is almost impossible to hide from me. And without a personal connection, then the only motivation you could have is mercenary, and that will be traceable by various other means.
Consider my curiosity satisfied. I was merely taken aback. I have participated in a dozen or so PsychoCIDE investigations over the last century, but this is the first time I have been abused by the lead investigator. I thought perhaps I had done something to offend you.
There was no question in her tone, and her eyes were flat. We had done ourselves some damage here. Still, we had to be sure. It was far-fetched that this woman was in any way involved, but far-fetched. Things happened all the time. If I was the director of a major soul bank and wanted one of my own clients dead, I would hire a hitter and kill them at home. I would want the murder to happen as far away from my own establishment as possible. To an outsider, this might seem paranoid and excessive, but it was merely the result of department policy and the correct apportionment of duty. As far as the order of the world was concerned, Damien Faulkner had entrusted his immortality to this woman, and he was now dead. That she was not at fault was immaterial. She was responsible, and thus was required to be a suspect. It was in fact a measure of her privilege and power that none of the other investigators over the years had followed proper protocol and treated her as suspect. As was always the case, There were some technical aspects that needed to be sorted out. The sort of thing that a director didn't have the know-how to answer. So we got clearance to go down to the vaults. Once inside the shining Fortress of Souls, we grilled the techs on their security procedures and took the victim's phylactery, as well as his soul access records, into state's evidence. You couldn't reincarnate without a phylactery. The data stored inside a save point was required. But even with the intricate mesh of nanofibers, there was a gap that existed between what material technology could accomplish and what we asked of it. The phylactery acted like a beacon for the soul. It allowed it to reconnect with a new body, and the uploaded mind and that supernal component filled in the gaps. You could load a mind using only a save point and a body, but the result was not quite fully there. Worse, a schism resonated with the original, and so long as both versions of a person existed, it created problems. Still, that was neither here nor there. It was well past dark by the time we exited the orchid structure of QMM and were greeted by the peaceful silence of the Adam habitat. It was such a contrast from my own neighborhood, or the neighborhoods that we usually frequented. Night often had sinister connotations in the worst neighborhoods, or at least a dizzy sort of celebratory air that came with an active nightlife. None of that was evident here in this little garden. Our feet made loud clops on the sidewalks as we made our way back towards the spaceport. Our presence was an intrusion, and this place hated us for our presence. I, for my part, hated it back.